Szydlo. I
You
am
are
a
joining your
senior
conference
and a
room.
grants
You are
project
the host.
officer in the Office of
Access
Orphan
is
Product
immediate.
Development.
For a menu
And
of
today
available
it's going to
prompts,
be my pleasure
press
to talk
6
to you
and
about
the pound
financial
key.
incentives for CDER medical products associated with the Office of Orphan Products Development. After I'm done speaking today, you should be able to describe the Office of Orphan Products Development, or OOPD's, Orphan Drug Designation Program, describe the OOPD Rare Pediatric Disease Designation Review Program, describe the OOPD Clinical Trials and Natural History Grants programs, and navigate to OOPD webpage resources for these specific programs. So I thought it would be a good idea to start with some background about the Office of Orphan Products Development. Our mission is to advance the evaluation and development of products, which includes drugs, biologics, devices, or medical foods that demonstrate promise for the diagnosis and/or treatment of rare diseases or conditions. This shows where we're located within the FDA. We are in the bottom left-hand corner there under Office of Clinical Policy and Programs. Please note that this is located within the Office of the Commissioner. We are not located within CDER, or the Center for Drugs, because as I mentioned, we do have some programs that are specific for other types of products, such as devices, which are regulated under CDRH, or the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. The OOPD was established after the Orphan Drug Act was created by Congress in 1983, and the idea was to motivate industry to develop drugs and biologics for rare diseases by providing financial incentives. Prior to the Orphan Drug Act, or the ODA, fewer than one drug per year was approved for rare diseases in the U.S. The Orphan Drug Act, however, has been very successful, and since 1983, we've approved over 780 products for over 250 rare diseases. Last year in 2018, the FDA had over 90 approvals for rare disease indications, which was the highest number since the Orphan Drug Act passed. And within CDER, 58% of the novel drug approvals were for rare diseases. So what does rare and orphan mean? A rare disease is defined in the Orphan Drug Act as either a disease or condition that affects less than 200,000 persons in the U.S. or affects equal to or greater than 200,000 persons in the U.S., but for which there is no reasonable expectation that the costs of developing and marketing the drug will be recovered from sales of the drug. And this second definition is not frequently used. An orphan drug is a drug or a biological product that's used for the prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of a rare disease in the U.S. So why are rare diseases important? As Peter mentioned, to date, more than 7,000 rare diseases have been identified. It's estimated that they affect about 30 million Americans, which is about 1 in 10. So if you yourself don't have a rare disease, you probably know someone that does. Examples include cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease, and certain cancers such as pancreatic cancer. Please note that although more than 7,000 rare diseases have been identified, I mentioned a couple minutes ago that there's only approved products for about 250 of those diseases, so there's still a lot of work to be done. The OOPD has 6 core programs. They're divided in general into the designation programs and the grant programs. The designation programs are the Orphan Drug Designation Program, Rare Pediatric Disease Designation, and Humanitarian Use Device Designation, or HUD program. The grants programs are Orphan Products Clinical Trials, the Pediatric Device Consortia, and the Orphan Products Natural History Grant Program. Today, I'll only be talking about those programs that are associated with CDER medical products. If you're interested in the other programs, please feel free to take a look at our website for more information. So the first program I'll be discussing is the Orphan Drug Designation Program, which most of you are probably familiar with. The Orphan Drug Act provides for FDA to designate a drug or biologic as a drug for a rare disease or condition. For us to grant this designation, your application must contain enough information to show that the drug shows promise for the prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of the rare disease or condition. It's important to note that designation is not given to a proposed indication or how a sponsor may wish to study a drug. Instead, designation is generally given to a broad disease. There's no fee for submitting a designation request. I want to emphasize here that designation requests must be submitted before you submit your marketing application, your NDA or your BLA. And an IND is not required. This graph shows the number of original designation requests and amendments that we've received and the number of designations granted over the last several years. The originals and amendments are in the blue and red, and the designations granted are in the light green bars. As you can see, the number of requests received and designations granted nearly doubled between 2012 and 2018. Since the Orphan Drug Act was enacted, we've received over 6,900 original requests and granted over 4,800 designations. This does not account for the number of amendments we've received, and nor do these numbers reflect that some requests and designations were later withdrawn. So there are several financial incentives that are associated with orphan drug designations. The first is tax credits up to 25% of qualified clinical trials costs. This particular incentive is administered by the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, so I will not be discussing it further today. The next incentive is a waiver of FDA user fees, and my colleague Jean covered that very well this morning. Sponsors are also eligible to receive 7 years of marketing exclusivity, and I'll discuss that more in a moment. And there are also orphan drug designation is now associated with additional financial incentives under the Affordable Care Act. Those incentives are also not administered by FDA or OOPD, so if you'd like information on those, I suggest you just check the internet. I'm going to start by talking about the 7 years of market exclusivity. And what this means is that the FDA cannot approve the same drug for the same indication if the drug is approved for an indication that's within scope of the orphan designation and the same drug has not been previously approved for the same indication. Orphan exclusivity is given only to the first sponsor to receive approval for that drug for the orphan designated indication. So this is a very valuable incentive. So Rinku talked about a lot of different types of orphan exclusivities, and I just wanted to reinforce that orphan exclusivity is distinct from the other types of exclusivities that a sponsor may be eligible for. Orphan exclusivity is determined by the OOPD upon marketing approval. We do sometimes seek input from the review division, particularly in cases where clinical superiority is involved, but ultimately the decision of whether or not to grant or recognize orphan exclusivity is determined by OOPD. By regulation, the OOPD sends a letter to recognize exclusive approval, which is a little bit different than other types of exclusivities. And once this letter is issued, then the orphan drug exclusivity, or ODE, is identified in the Orange Book. I should note that there are cases and situations where exclusivity can be broken. The first is in situations where there's a drug shortage. So if a sponsor is unable to meet the needs of patients with the rare disease, their exclusivity can be broken. And this other situation is when another drug is clinically superior to the approved drug, exclusivity can be broken per se. So this diagram shows how one drug may receive multiple exclusivities under one orphan drug designation. And it also shows the relationship between a designation and an indication. So this example is factor 13, which is a rare bleeding disorder. The sponsor received Orphan Drug Designation for treatment of congenital factor 13 deficiency, again, the broad disease. Later, the sponsor received approval for routine prophylactic treatment of congenital factor 13 deficiency, and they received 7 years of ODE for that indication. Later, the sponsor also was approved for perioperative management of surgical bleeding in patients with congenital factor 13 deficiency, and they also received 7 years of Orphan Drug Exclusivity for that specific indication. So this diagram shows the overall process of Orphan Drug Designation and Orphan Exclusivity. Step 1, which is optional, meaning that if you're developing a drug for a rare disease, there's no requirement for you to submit Orphan Drug Designation request. Step 1 is to submit the Orphan Drug Designation request to OOPD. We review the request and we either issue a deficiency or denial letter, or we grant the designation. And at that point, sponsors can start to receive the financial incentives associated with Orphan Drug Designation. Step 2, the sponsor would submit their marketing application, their NDA or BLA, to the review division, and if they've received Orphan Drug Designation, the user fee is waived. The review division in the centers review the marketing application, and they either issue a disapproval or complete response letter, or the product, hopefully, is approved for marketing. And that brings us to step 3, which is Orphan Exclusivity determination. And as I mentioned, this is determined by the OOPD, as you can see from the red dotted line. And also, as I mentioned, we do consult with the review divisions as needed. It should be noted that designation can be revoked at any time if there is evidence that the product was ineligible for designation at the time the request was submitted. And I'd also like to emphasize here that 2 things. First, that the request for Orphan Drug Designation must be submitted before the marketing application. And secondly, as I said, so the sponsor must submit their marketing application before they must submit their Orphan Drug Designation before the marketing application is submitted. And the other thing I wanted to mention was that while I said that the Orphan Designation step is optional, you do need to submit that request in order to, and receive actual designation in order to receive any of the financial incentives associated with it. So now I'm going to go over a few questions that we try to answer when we review a designation request. And hopefully this will provide some insight that will help you submit a successful Orphan Drug Designation application. There are 5 critical questions. The first one is, what is the disease or condition the drug is treating, diagnosing, or preventing? The second question, is the disease or condition rare? If this disease or condition is not rare, is there an orphan subset demonstration? Number 4, is there a description of the drug and adequate scientific rationale? And number 5, is it the same drug as a previously approved drug for the same use? And I'll go through each of these in a little bit of detail. The first question, what is the disease or condition the drug is treating, diagnosing, or preventing? That sounds like a straightforward question. However, often it is not. With rare diseases, this can be very challenging and it can evolve with time. And the reason for that is that many of these diseases are very poorly understood. In general, the OOPD looks at a number of factors that we assess cumulatively to determine what the disease is. And these include pathogenesis of the disease or condition, course of the disease or condition, its prognosis, and resistance to treatment. The next question we ask is whether the rare disease, as generally defined by the Orphan Drug Act, is a disease or condition that affects less than 200,000 persons in the US. For therapeutic drugs, we look at the prevalence of the disease. And again, this must be less than 200,000. Prevalence is defined in the Orphan Drug Regulations as the number of persons in the US who have been diagnosed as having the disease or condition at the time of the submission of the request. For vaccines, diagnostics, and preventive drugs, we would look at the number of persons that the drug will be administered to in the US to determine if it's less than 200,000 per year. So in certain situations, we can grant orphan drug designation even if a disease or condition occurs in greater than 200,000 persons, or if it is non-rare. This is not commonly done. However, there's something called an orphan subset. And what this means is that use of the drug is appropriate in an orphan subset due to one or more properties of the drug, but the drug would be inappropriate in the remaining persons with such disease or condition. And what we would take into consideration here is the drug's toxicity, its mechanism of action, or previous clinical experience with the drug. It's important to note that the orphan subset must still meet the regulatory threshold of 200,000 in the US. And it's also important to note that an orphan subset can't be arbitrary. It can't be based on, for example, how a sponsor may wish to study the drug. So specifically, an orphan subset cannot be considered without reference to the drug and its specific properties. Next, we look for the drug description and scientific rationale. So in general, orphan drug designation attaches to the active moiety. So your application should include a thorough and succinct description of the active moiety for your proposed drug product. It should also include some general information about the drug product, such as the name and address of the manufacturer, and whether it's an injectable or an oral product. Next, we look at the scientific rationale. In the regulations, it states that the scientific rationale must establish a medically plausible basis for the use of the drug for the rare disease or condition. And there's different types of data you can provide to establish this. The strongest data would be clinical data. We sort of consider that the gold standard, and that would be the strongest evidence you can provide to support an orphan drug designation. In certain situations, we will also accept case reports for use of your drug in the rare disease if you do provide adequate detail about those particular cases. In addition, we'll accept data from acceptable animal models of a certain human disease. And in unusual situations, if there's no clinical data and there's no adequate animal model of a human disease, we will accept in vitro data along with a thorough explanation of the drug's proposed mechanism of action and the pathogenesis of the disease. Next, we ask, is it the same drug as a previously approved drug for the same use? Same drug is defined in the Orphan Drug Regulations in 21 CFR 316.3b14, and it does not mean that the two products are identical. If your drug product contains a small molecule, same drug means that your product contains the same active moiety as a previously approved drug. If your proposed drug product contains macromolecules, then it contains the same principal molecular structural features of a previously approved drug, it would be considered the same drug. For example, two protein drugs are the same if the only differences were due to post-translational events, minor differences in amino acid sequences, different glycosylation patterns, etc. And I would suggest that you review the orphan drug regulations and how this section might pertain to your product before you submit an orphan drug designation request. The reason this is important is that when sponsors are seeking designation of a drug that is the same as an already approved drug for the same use, you must provide a plausible hypothesis of clinical superiority for your product. And so what does clinical superiority mean? That is also defined in the Orphan Drug Regulations, and it can fall into one of three categories. Your product could show greater effectiveness, greater safety, or in unusual cases when neither greater effectiveness nor greater safety can be shown, a major contribution to patient care, or MIC-to-PIC. It's very important to note that in order to get 7 years of market exclusivity, the regulations require that sponsors must demonstrate that their product's actually clinically superior. So at that point, a hypothesis is no longer sufficient. There's a number of resources available to help you submit an orphan drug designation request. The first is OOPD's public database. This database displays all of the drugs that have received orphan drug designation. As soon as we issue a letter, it is displayed in this public database, and you can look drugs up by the generic name, by the trade name. You can look up by a specific disease to see what your competitors may be developing, and you can also look up by a date range, and I have a link to that site there. Another good resource is OOPD's Orphan Drug Designation Program webpage, and this contains links to several different sites such as the Orphan Drug Act and the regulations, and there's also an FAQs page. The next resource is the Orphan Drug Designation Request Form, or Form FDA 4035. This is an optional form, but we do encourage its use. It was designed and developed a couple of years ago to assist sponsors in providing the required content of a designation request both completely and succinctly. I have a screenshot of it here on the right, and you can see it's a fillable PDF, and each section contains a link to the pertinent section of the orphan drug regulations, and there's also some tips for each section, so it really walks a sponsor through the entire process, and we do encourage its use. The next resource is a tutorial called Recommended Tips for Creating an Orphan Drug Designation Application. This tutorial is on our website, and the link is in the title of the slide. It addresses common issues that are found during the designation review process, and it also provides general tips for submitting an orphan drug designation request, such as page limits that are suggested, how to organize your request. And I would strongly encourage you to review this tutorial, especially if you've never submitted an orphan drug designation request. It contains a lot of very useful information about the ins and outs of submitting an orphan drug designation request, and it's very, very helpful. The next program I'll be discussing is the Rare Pediatric Disease Designation Program. The Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program was created in 2012 under Section 529 of the FDA Act to encourage development of drugs and biologics for rare pediatric diseases. As Peter discussed, the basic idea behind this is that if a sponsor receives approval of a rare pediatric disease product application for a rare pediatric disease, then they're eligible to receive a voucher. The priority review voucher can then be redeemed, or it can be transferred to another sponsor to obtain priority review of an application that would otherwise be ineligible for priority review. Peter talked a lot about the voucher process. I'm going to focus on the Rare Pediatric Disease Designation, which is an optional step in the process. So once again, a rare pediatric disease is defined as a rare disease or condition that affects less than 200,000 persons in the U.S., or greater than equal to 200,000 persons, and for which there's no reasonable expectations that the cost of developing and making the drug available can be recovered from sales of the drug. And the second criteria was slightly amended in the Advancing Hope Act of 2016 to more precisely define what a rare pediatric disease was and better exercise the intent of this particular legislation. The second criteria is that the disease is a serious or life-threatening disease in which the serious or life-threatening manifestations primarily affect individuals aged from birth to 18 years. So once again, RPD designation is an optional step. It's not required, nor is it sufficient alone to receive a voucher. However, requesting RPD designation in advance will expedite a sponsor's future request for a priority review voucher, and I'll show you why that's the case in a moment. RPD designation requests must be submitted before the FDA has filed the NDA for the drug or the relevant indication. So that's similar to an orphan drug designation, but in this case it's slightly different in that it has to be submitted before filing. So this diagram shows the overall RPD process. On the top left, sorry, it got cut off a little bit, the sponsor would submit their RPD designation request to the OOPD. The OOPD would review the designation request in conjunction with one of our sister offices, the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics. And we would look for whether the disease is rare and do the serious or life-threatening manifestations primarily affect individuals 0 to 18. If the answer is no, we would issue a deficiency letter. If the answer is yes, we would grant the designation. On the right-hand side is the process for submitting the NDA or BLA. The sponsor would submit that to the review division in CDER or CBER, and they will look at whether the application is for a rare pediatric disease product. If the sponsor has not received designation, they would send a consult to us. So it's more efficient if you've requested this in advance because it saves this step, and you've also received some early feedback from the agency on whether you might be eligible for a voucher. And then the last step on the bottom right, if the answer to the question is yes, then the review division would issue the voucher if all of the other conditions are met for a voucher. So in terms of the process, the RPD designation request should be submitted to OOPD. The OOPD and the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics jointly conduct a review of the RPD request. In terms of what you should include in the request, it should include similar information to an orphan drug designation request, with emphasis on being clear on two things. First, is the disease or condition rare? And also be very clear on whether the serious or life-threatening manifestations primarily affect individuals aged from birth to 18 years. This graph shows the number of original RPD designation requests, amendments, and the number of designations granted since the program began in 2013. To date, the OOPD has received over 200 requests, and over 160, or about 79%, have been determined to meet the criteria for designation as a rare pediatric disease. There are two good resources for RPD designation. The first is the draft guidance called Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Vouchers, Draft Guidance for Industry. Please note, however, that the guidance has not yet been updated to reflect the changes made to the definition in the law by the Advancing Hope Act of 2016. And the other good resource is the OOPD RPD program webpage, which there's an embedded hyperlink to in this slide. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about our grants programs. The first grants program I'm going to discuss is the Orphan Products Clinical Trials Grant Program. The goal of this program is to provide financial support for efficient and innovative clinical trials for products that either address unmet needs in a rare disease or condition or provide highly significant improvements in treatment or diagnosis of a rare disease or condition. Products that are eligible for a clinical trials grant include drugs, biologics, devices, and medical foods. And once again, the requirement is that the disease or condition has a prevalence of less than 200,000 in the U.S. Although most of our grants are for treatments for rare diseases, diagnostics and vaccines may also be eligible if they'll be administered to less than 200,000 people per year. Since this program's inception in 1983, we've received over 2,700 applications, or about 100 per year. We've provided over $400 million to fund over 600 studies, and we've contributed to more than 60 products receiving marketing approval. In fiscal year 2018 alone, we received 79 grant applications, and we awarded 12 new clinical trial research grants. These totaled more than $18 million of funding to be provided over the next 4 years. The budget for this program is approximately $15.5 million per year, and we typically have between 60 and 85 ongoing grant-funded projects at any one time. Funding levels used to be based on the particular phase of the clinical trial. That's no longer the case, so funding is no longer based on the phase of the study. Application budgets are not limited, but they do need to reflect the actual needs of the proposed project. and the maximum project period for funding is 4 years. With regard to eligibility, foreign or domestic, public or private, for-profit or nonprofit entities are eligible to apply, as well as state and local units of government. Federal agencies, however, may not apply. Orphan drug designation is encouraged, but it is not required. And funding is dependent on 3 things. First, scientific merits of the application. Second, availability of federal funds. And third, relevance of the study to program priorities. So the grant applications are reviewed by a panel. The panel consists of internal reviewers and external rare disease experts. There's typically about 5 people on this panel. And we also invite the medical officer from the review division to participate. Although they do not score the application, they're there to provide a regulatory perspective if any questions come up regarding this. This slide is a bit wordy, I do apologize for that, but these are the 5 criteria that a grant application is scored upon. So the panel will look at number 1, the rationale, and here I want to emphasize again that the study should address an unmet medical need in a rare disease or provide highly significant improvements in treatment or diagnosis. Number 2, they look at the study design and inclusion of patient input. Number 3, they look at the qualifications of the investigators. Number 4, they look at infrastructure and resources. And lastly, they look at the ability of the study to advance the current field. So there's a number of requirements to receive a grant. The first is that it must be a clinical study of an orphan disease or condition. The study must advance information towards a market approval because that's the ultimate goal. You must have an active IND. It can't be on clinical hold. The study must follow good clinical practices. You must obtain human subjects assurance from the Office of Human Research Protections or a federal-wide assurance or FWA. You must have Institution Review Board approval or IRB approval. And you'll need to provide OOPD with confirmation that you have a sufficient supply of the drug to complete the study. For fiscal year 2020, the next application due date is June 25th. That's coming up very quickly. I'd like to note that there are several registrations that are required prior to submitting a grant application, and these can take 6 weeks or more, such as ERA Commons and a DUNS number. So it may not be feasible for you to submit a grant application with this particular cycle, but if you keep an eye on OOPD's website, we do post there when we do put out a call for applications. The best resource for information about the Clinical Trials Grants Program is the OOPD Clinical Trials Grants Program webpage, and I do have a hyperlink there in the slide. I sort of consider this particular website or webpage to be one-stop shopping. It contains a lot of information and many useful links. It includes FAQs. There's a page for information on how to apply for funding. There's previous webinars and presentations. And there's also a searchable database for past and present funded grants. And it works very similar to the public database that I showed you for orphan drug designations. The last program that I'm going to discuss is the Natural History Grant Program. This is our newest program, and I won't spend too much time on it because there are a lot of similarities with the Clinical Trials Grants Program. So the first question that many of you are probably asking is, what is a natural history study? The natural history of a disease is traditionally considered the natural course of a disease from the time immediately prior to its inception, progressing through its symptomatic phase and different clinical stages, to the point where it has ended without external intervention. A natural history study tracks the course of the disease over time, identifies demographic, genetic, environmental, and other variables that correlate with its development and outcomes. And you can probably tell from this definition that an understanding of the natural history of a disease is critical to the development of a product to treat a rare disease. And unfortunately, with many rare diseases, there's very little known about the natural history of these diseases. So this program was developed as a way to try to address this issue. The goal, again, is to provide financial support for efficient and innovative studies that advance rare disease medical product development through characterization of the natural history of rare diseases or conditions with unmet needs, and to exert a significant and broad impact on a specific rare disease or multiple rare diseases with similar pathophysiology. Ultimately, the goal is to assist in marketing approval. Our first call for applications for this program was in 2016, and we received an overwhelming response. We received 89 applications, and 83 of these were considered responsive. We ended up awarding $6.3 million to 4 grants for studies that lasted 2 to 5 years, and 2 additional grants were co-funded by the NIH and FDA. Our second cycle, we're sort of right in the middle of that right now. The application deadline for that was January 10th of this year. We received 31 applications. We will be holding a panel to review these applications on June 24th, and funding is expected to begin by September 30th of this year. Eligibility is similar to the clinical trials program. Foreign or domestic, public or private, for-profit or nonprofit entities are eligible, as well as state and local units of government. Federal agencies, however, may not apply. Funding, again, is dependent on 3 things: the scientific merits of the application, the availability of federal funds, and the relevance of the study to program priorities. The review of these applications works a little bit different than the clinical trials program. First, all the applications are reviewed and scored by a panel of external rare disease experts and internal regulatory technical experts. Those that receive the best scores are going to go to that panel that I mentioned to be held on June 24th, and this panel will include some additional folks, such as some patient representatives and statistical reviewers who will also review the applications and provide feedback on them. The review criteria that they will look at is very similar to the clinical trials grants program, those 5 criteria that I showed, so I won't go through that in detail. The budget for this program is approximately $2 million per year. In terms of funding levels, the application budgets are no longer limited, but do need to reflect the actual needs of the proposed project, and the panels do look at the budgets. The maximum project period for a prospective natural history study is 4 years, and for a retrospective natural history study, it's 2 years. At this time, the next call for applications hasn't been determined yet, but if you're interested in this program, you can keep an eye on OPD's Natural History Grants Program webpage, and there's a link to that at the bottom of the slide. So I'd like to conclude with some hints for submitting a grant application. First, we recommend that you start as early as possible, you plan carefully, you write clearly and objectively. Number 2, we recommend that you read the request for applications, or the RFA, and the instructions very carefully, and not just for deadlines. This is a very dense document. There's a lot of information in it, but it's very important that you read it, and you read it carefully. Number 3, we recommend that you take a look at the grants writing tips, which are available on the National Institutes of Health, or NIH Extramural Programs webpage. This can be particularly helpful if you've never submitted a grant application before. Number 4, remember that the panel reviewers are very busy people. The panels consist of both internal and external experts, so whenever possible, it's best if you can say things succinctly and in fewer words whenever possible. Number 5, we recommend that you establish good relations with your FDA review divisions through the IND process. Again, the review division does not score the application, but they are invited to the panel as a resource. And this recommendation would also apply for orphan drug designations. It's a good idea to establish a good relationship with the review division because they can be an excellent resource for protocol advice. Number 6, if you've looked over our website and you've read the RFA and all of the other information, you still have questions, you can call us at the number listed here. Number 7, if you need help with the budget, we do have a specific person assigned to our grants in the Grants Management Office. His name is Dan Lukash and his phone number is listed here. Number 8, if you do not have expertise for certain issues, we recommend that you provide letters of collaboration for the needed expertise, and this can help improve your score. Number 9, use outside readers to improve the quality of the proposal. So it's always a good idea to write your proposal up and then have someone else read it with fresh eyes who hasn't seen it before. They can often catch a lot of mistakes and things you didn't mean to say. And number 10, don't be discouraged. Our program is fairly competitive for the clinical trials program. Typically, the success rate is about 15%. Again, don't be discouraged if you don't receive a grant. We do provide summary statements, which are a summary of the feedback from the panel. So it will include both strengths and weaknesses of your proposal. And we suggest that if you address all the critiques that are provided, it will improve the quality of your study. So here is our link to our webpage. If you have questions after looking at our webpage, you can email us at orphan@fda.hhs.gov, and our main number is 301-796-8660. So this is our first challenge question. A sponsor can submit an orphan drug designation request, A, anytime prior to approval of their marketing application, B, anytime prior to submission of the marketing application, C, whether or not they have an IND for the drug application, or D, B and C. So the correct answer to this question is B and C. An orphan drug designation request can be submitted anytime prior to submission of the marketing application and regardless of whether or not you have an IND. Number 2, organizations that are eligible to apply for an orphan products clinical trials grant include A, foreign or domestic entities, B, for-profit and nonprofit entities, C, state and local units of government, or D, all of the above. And the answer to that question is D, all of the above. So this concludes my presentation. We're going to take a short break now to gather questions, and we'll be back shortly.